Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Rob's Movie Reviews. This week, I want to talk about the second film in a four film series that I'm doing on the best versions of Dracula. And I'm excluding, all the off spin-off stories, No Son of Dracula or Dracula Meets Frankenstein. I'm talking about the traditional Dracula story as in Bram Stoker's novel. As you remember, last week we did the 1931 Bela Lugosi version. This week we're going to discuss the version that came out in 1958 that made Mr. Christopher Lee into a superstar, as well as Mr. Peter Cushing. It was the second film that those two gentlemen had appeared in together, and that's in the same year. The first being the Curse of Frankenstein, which we will go into in another series I intend to do in the very near future. But today we're going to talk about the horror of Dracula. As you can see, it's like the Bela Lugosi version. I also got this film, Horror of Dracula, in a nice box set with three other of the Hammer Dracula movies. This is a great movie. It was directed by Mr. Terrence Fisher, a staple with Hammer Studios. He directed quite a few films for Hammer over the years. Like I said, this movie is the second outing of Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing together. This film also stars Michael Gough and Melissa Stribling. Now, of the four best versions of Dracula made, this one tends to steer away off the beaten path. It kind of takes a lot more liberties than the others that I'm going to talk about. It's not so much they changed a lot of things, but I kind of like to look at it as a reimagining, which is a fairly new term that's being used nowadays, but it's pretty accurate in this case. This film is a reimagining of the Bram Stoker story about Dracula. Right away, as soon as the film starts, you notice a lot of differences. Transylvania is never mentioned. In fact, they never really say what country Dracula's castle is in or what country Jonathan Harker traveled from to get to Dracula's castle. I'm assuming, given the geography and the look of the towns and villages, that it's somewhere in Central Europe. But the film starts with Jonathan Harker arriving at Castle Dracula. He's been hired by Count Dracula to come in and be his librarian, to index all of his books. Apparently, he has thousands of volumes of books that he needs indexed. Harker comes in, takes the job. As soon as he gets there, he's met by a woman who begs him to help her to get her away because the Count is evil and she's being held against her will. And Jonathan seems perplexed and a little bit, baffled by this, but he promises the young lady to help her. Shortly after she walks away, or actually she leaves because she can sense Dracula is coming. That's when we see Christopher Lee at the top of the staircase. Wonderful first appearance. He has a great entrance in this movie. He just sets the tone for the whole movie right away when the camera pans up to the top of the stairs and you see Christopher Lee standing there. And he comes down and introduces himself to Jonathan, shows him to his room. Once Jonathan's alone in his room, that's when we discover that Jonathan knows that Dracula is a vampire and his real reason for being there is to destroy Dracula. He leaves his room in the middle of the night to go search for Dracula. He encounters the young lady again. Again, she begs him to help her. She throws herself into his arms, and as he's embracing her, that's when we discover that she is also a vampire and she's just playing on his emotions. And she bites him on the neck, but just as she bites him, Dracula comes into the room enraged that she had the nerve to feed on someone that he had intended to keep for himself, and he tosses her aside. Next thing we see, Jonathan's waking up in his room the next day. The day's almost over with already. The sun's already beginning to set. Jonathan goes once again in search of Dracula, hoping to catch him while he's still in his crypt. And he does, but right next to him is the crypt with the female vampire in it. He makes a mistake and chooses to drive a stake through her heart first. And as he's doing so, the sun sets, and it gives Dracula the opportunity to rise up out of his crypt. We leave Jonathan there and we go back to the city where Jonathan's fiance, Lucy, is very ill. She's the sister of Arthur Homewood, who is married to Mina. You can see where they've changed some things up there. And they encounter Dr. Von Helsing, who was a good friend of Jonathan's and is very concerned because he hasn't returned yet. That's when they get word that Jonathan has died. Dr. Von Helsing immediately knows what happened. He's aware of the situation with Dracula as well. He knows that Dracula is a vampire. Excuse me there, my mouth was getting a little dry. He tries to explain it to Arthur, who doesn't want to hear it. That's when Arthur pretty much just tells him, go away, don't come around here no more. All you've done is brought us anguish and grief. He tries to warn them that Lucy is in grave danger. They don't heed his warning. He does convince them at night to put garlic in her room all around the windows and to keep all the windows and doors to her bedroom locked up. In the middle of the night, Lucy throws a fit because she can't stand the smell of the garlic. The maid comes in, removes them. Shortly thereafter, here comes Dracula. He comes into the room. This time, his bite is fatal, and Lucy dies. Once again, Von Helsing shows up, trying to convince them what happened. Again, Arthur doesn't want to hear it. This is when a police officer shows up at the house with Lucy's little niece and tells her to tell him tells the little girl, tell them the story you told me. And that's when she tells them that she was approached by a woman who lured her into a dark, secluded place and then tried to bite her on the neck. And when they asked her if she knew who the woman was, she said yes, it was Aunt Lucy. Arthur is just shocked by this, as well as Mina. Of course, Dr. Von Helsing is not, because he fully expected it. He convinces Arthur to let the little girl leave the house again the next night, hoping that Lucy will come seek her out again, and she does. And they use the little girl as bait to draw Lucy out, and she leads them back to her lair, where Dr. Von Helsing is able to put a stake through her heart and end her curse and set her soul free. Arthur is just torn up by this, obviously, Lucy being his sister. But it's at that moment that he swears that he'll do anything and everything Von Helsing asks of him. He wants to help Von Helsing rid the world of this terrible evil that is Dracula. Now Dracula starts going after Mina. Despite their best efforts, he still gets into the house. He bites her. He ends up taking her and fleeing back to his castle with Mina. There's a big chase where Arthur and Dr. Von Helsing in one carriage, Dracula about an hour ahead of him in his. He gets back to the castle before sunrise. Von Helsing and Arthur come riding up just as he's getting Mina out of the carriage. He means to destroy them immediately, but then he sees the sun beginning to rise over the mountains, so he has to retreat to his castle. Arthur grabs Mina and comforts her while Von Helsing chases Dracula into the castle. There's a big fight between the two of them. It looks like Dracula is going to get the best of Von Helsing, but in a move of desperation, Von Helsing rips the curtains down off of one of the windows and lets the morning sunlight come in, and Dracula is reduced to dust. And thus ends the horror of Dracula. It's a wonderful movie. Like I said, it does stray quite a bit from the Bram Stoker novel, but it's still a wonderful reimagining of the same story. There's enough elements there from the Bram Stoker story that it ties in nicely. It's a very good movie. it really helped establish Hammer Studios for the next decade and a half afterwards as the leading horror studio in the world. There would be many, many sequels to this film, and it, like I said, it really launched the careers of both Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. So that ends my review of the horror of Dracula. Be sure to join me back here next week when I will discuss the 1979 Frank Langella version of Dracula. And until then, you all take care.